The morning light over rural America in the early years of the 1930s carried a muted, quiet tone. A soft, pale hue that touched the frost on wooden fences, the brittle grass beneath schoolyard gates, and the long dirt roads that stretched toward single-room schoolhouses standing alone against the open horizon. Coal smoke rose from small chimneys. The bell rope hung by the door. And in the thin, cold air, every footstep of a child walking toward school felt like a reminder of the time they lived in. An era shaped by hardship, determination, and the slow, silent weight of the Great Depression. In many towns, classrooms were still warmed by pot-bellied stoves that crackled through winter mornings. The desks carried carvings from students who had sat there years before. The windows rattled when the wind pressed against them. On the surface, it looked simple, ordinary. But underneath, each lesson taught in those rooms carried the lived reality of an entire country fighting for stability. School in the United States during the 1930s reflected the challenges, the hopes, and the resilience of a population learning to survive uncertain times. And inside every small structure where children gathered to learn, the atmosphere held the strange mixture of fear and aspiration that defined the decade. Across the country, from large cities to prairie towns, the education system was reshaped by financial collapse. This was the period after the stock market crash when nearly every community felt the strain. Schools depended heavily on local taxes. When jobs disappeared and families struggled to buy food, school budgets shattered almost overnight. Teachers received late paychecks or none at all. Some districts shortened the school year, others merged classrooms. And in the most troubled places, doors closed entirely. Yet despite the obstacles, millions of American children still walked to school each day, carrying books with worn covers, lunches wrapped in newspaper, and the hope that learning might offer something better than the world outside. In many rural states, the journey to school was a daily challenge. Automobiles were scarce and buses were limited. The roads were often muddy, uneven, or blocked by snow. Children walked several miles, sometimes arriving with wet shoes, cold hands, and a quiet pride because this effort was simply understood as part of life. In oral histories recorded decades later, people recalled walking in groups for warmth, following the sound of the ringing bell that signaled the start of the school day. The bell didn't just call students to their lessons. It symbolized structure in a time that had lost so much stability. And as the children filed in, the day opened with the teacher taking attendance and the slow, steady rhythm of a school routine. Inside the classroom, a teacher in the 1930s often taught multiple grades at once. A single educator in a rural school might instruct children aged 6 through 14 in the same room. The desks were arranged by age and ability. The youngest sat in the front, learning the alphabet, while older students completed arithmetic or geography at the back. The sound of recitation filled the room, steady, overlapping voices repeating facts that were memorized daily. It was a structure created to manage the complexity of teaching so many levels at once. And for decades, it remained one of the defining characteristics of American rural education. Textbooks during this decade were simple, durable, and reused year after year. Many were part of state-issued series printed in earlier decades. Reading lessons often came from stories about patriotism, industry, and moral responsibility. The language was straightforward, reflecting the educational philosophy of the time, to create disciplined, orderly citizens with strong work habits. Memorization was central. Students copied passages. They recited multiplication tables, state capitals, and historical dates. And although the curriculum lacked the variety expected in modern classrooms, it offered children a structured world at a time when so much outside the schoolhouse walls felt uncertain. In larger cities, education looked noticeably different. School buildings were bigger, often constructed with brick, and divided into grade-specific classrooms. The 1930s saw the continuation of the progressive education movement in urban districts. This movement encouraged hands-on activities, social cooperation, and critical thinking. Schools experimented with group projects, school gardens, shop classes, and health programs. Many offered physical education, art, and music. Progressive schools aimed to prepare children for practical life skills, not just academic knowledge. But this philosophy was uneven across the country. In wealthy cities, it thrived. In rural towns, it had far less influence because resources were limited and communities relied on familiar traditions. Discipline in both rural and urban schools reflected the values of the period. Teachers held high authority. Students were expected to sit straight, keep quiet unless called on, and show respect by standing when the teacher entered the room. If they misbehaved, consequences were immediate. Corporal punishment was legal and widely practiced. The goal wasn't cruelty, it reflected common ideas of the time about building character and responsibility. Parents almost always supported the teacher's decisions, because the school was seen as a pillar of community order during a period when families struggled to maintain structure in their own homes. The economic hardship of the decade shaped the appearance and daily life of students in ways that were unmistakable. Many children came to school wearing patched clothes or hand-me-downs. Some arrived hungry. Lunch programs existed in certain cities, but most rural districts relied on families, churches, or voluntary efforts to help students who had little to eat. In the winter, classrooms grew cold when districts could not afford coal. Photographs from the era show students bundled in coats during lessons, their breath visible in the air. Teachers, too, often paid for supplies out of their own limited salaries. Chalk, paper, and ink were precious. Every piece was used carefully, sometimes erased and reused until it could no longer serve its purpose. Despite the limitations, schools also became safe places for children facing emotional and economic pressures. The classroom offered structure, the teacher offered guidance, and the routine, recitation, writing practice, arithmetic, reading lessons created a daily rhythm that helped children feel grounded. Survivors of the era often remembered their teachers not just as instructors, but as steady figures who provided comfort during uncertain times. The weight teachers carried was significant. They were expected to educate, support, and sometimes even feed their students. As the country sank deeper into economic crisis, innovation emerged from necessity. Some states introduced school consolidation, closing small one-room buildings and transporting students to larger, centralized schools. The process was slow, but the 1930s marked the beginning of a major transition in American education. The movement toward consolidation aimed to reduce costs, standardize teaching, and offer students access to broader resources. But it also caused tension in communities that valued their small local schools. Schoolhouses were markers of identity, built by earlier generations, and closing them felt like losing a part of the town's history. Yet economic pressures left many districts with little choice. For countless families, the shift meant longer travel times but more stable educational opportunities. Alongside financial struggles, racial segregation shaped the school experience in deeply unequal ways. In the 1930s, Jim Crow laws enforced separate schools for black children across the South. These schools were chronically underfunded, often lacking basic supplies and adequate buildings. Teachers received lower pay, and classes operated with fewer resources. Despite the hardships, black communities maintained strong commitment to education, raising funds for school buildings, textbooks, and teacher salaries. The Rosenwald schools, built in earlier decades through a partnership between black communities and philanthropic support, continued to serve thousands of students during this period. Inside those classrooms, the commitment to learning remained a powerful act of resilience, yet the inequality was clear. While some white schools added programs, black schools struggled for essentials, creating profound disparities that would persist for decades. Meanwhile, Native American education was also shaped by government policy. Boarding schools still operated under systems designed to assimilate Native children into mainstream American culture. By the 1930s, some reforms had begun, especially after critical reports revealed harsh conditions. Efforts were made to shift toward community-based schooling and integrate more culturally relevant education. But the legacy of earlier decades remained present in the daily lives of Native children who experienced strict regimentation, limited freedom, and cultural suppression. The schools of the 1930s carried the weight of this complex history, influencing generations to come. In the western states, the Dust Bowl brought additional challenges. Severe drought and soil erosion forced thousands of families to leave their homes, especially in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. Schools in these regions faced dwindling enrollment, damaged buildings, and dust storms that blew dirt through windows and settled on desks before lessons could begin. Teachers later recalled days when visibility outside was so poor that school seemed suspended in a dark haze. When families migrated west to California, their children entered unfamiliar schools where they were sometimes viewed as outsiders. Overcrowding and prejudice created new obstacles, but education remained a central anchor for families trying to rebuild their lives. As conditions worsened nationally, the federal government introduced several programs to stabilize education. One of the most significant initiatives was the Works Progress Administration, which funded the construction and repair of school buildings across the country. WPA workers built classrooms, playgrounds, and libraries, leaving a physical legacy that would reshape American education for generations. The Civilian Conservation Corps, although not a traditional school, provided education for young men working in conservation camps. They received instruction in basic literacy, vocational training, and life skills. These programs reflected a broader understanding that education was essential to national recovery. Another important development came from the growth of vocational training. During the 1930s, many high schools expanded courses in agriculture, mechanics, home economics, and industrial arts. These programs prepared students for practical work during a time when academic success alone did not guarantee employment. The emphasis on hands-on learning aligned with the progressive education movement in urban districts while serving economic needs in rural communities. In some towns, school workshops built furniture, repaired tools, or produced equipment for local use. Students learned skills that supported their families and contributed to community resilience. The daily rhythm of school life varied across regions, but certain activities were common everywhere. Morning pledges and patriotic songs were routine, reflecting the civic values of the era. Writing practice filled notebooks with careful, slanted letters. Geography lessons traced rivers, mountain ranges, and state boundaries. Science instruction focused on basic natural observations, simple experiments, and farm-related information in rural schools. History classes emphasized national unity, the founding principles of the United States, and the stories of early American leaders. These narratives reinforced cultural ideals that communities believed were necessary during difficult times. Recess offered children a rare moment of freedom. Schoolyards lacked modern playground equipment, but students created their own games. They ran, played tag, jumped rope, or threw homemade balls. On farms, recess might include chores, fetching water, stacking wood, or cleaning the yard around the schoolhouse. The simplicity of these activities reflected the era's modest resources, yet children often remembered these moments fondly. Outdoor play became a small escape from the pressures adults faced at home. When the school day ended, many students returned to farms or households where their labor was essential. Chores included milking cows, tending fields, sewing clothes, or caring for younger siblings. Homework was often completed late at night by the dim light of oil lamps. For children living in cities, after-school hours might involve helping with family businesses, selling newspapers, or assisting at home. Education competed with economic survival, and families balanced these demands as best they could. Yet even in families facing great hardship, the value placed on schooling remained strong. Parents encouraged attendance because they believed education could offer a path to a more stable future. Teachers in the 1930s demonstrated remarkable perseverance. Many worked long hours for low wages. Some districts paid them in scrip, a form of temporary currency, or delayed payment until taxes were collected. Teachers often lived with local families, participated in community events, and became deeply integrated into the lives of their students. They took pride in shaping the next generation, even as they confronted their own financial struggles. Their dedication helped keep the education system functioning at a time when it could have collapsed entirely. The cultural atmosphere of the decade influenced not only what was taught, but how students felt inside the classroom. News of unemployment, foreclosures, and national uncertainty traveled quickly. Some children carried the emotional weight of family difficulties. Teachers noticed the quietness in their faces, the fatigue from long hours of labor, or the anxiety reflected in their posture. Yet schools provided a sense of belonging. Group activities such as music, art, and community events helped maintain morale. Holiday programs, recitals, and school fairs brought towns together, offering rare moments of joy and unity during a difficult decade. As the 1930s progressed, high school attendance increased across the nation. The economic crisis played a role, jobs were limited, and families saw education as a safe place for their children to remain while the economy struggled. Many states passed laws encouraging or requiring attendance, gradually shifting public expectations. The idea of universal high school education gained strength, setting the stage for major transformations in the decades that followed. Students who might previously have left school after 8th grade now continued their studies, preparing themselves for an unpredictable future. Another shift emerged in the relationship between schools and health. Medical inspections, vaccination programs, and hygiene lessons became more common. Nurses visited classrooms, checking for illnesses that could spread rapidly in crowded environments. Health education encouraged cleanliness, proper nutrition, and physical activity. These initiatives reflected growing public awareness of the connection between health and academic performance, particularly in communities where poverty threatened basic well-being. Libraries also gained importance during this era. Some schools received books from city donation drives or government programs. Traveling libraries visited rural areas, bringing collections to communities that lacked access to reading materials. In classrooms, students eagerly borrowed books, discovering stories and information that expanded their understanding of the world. Reading offered both escape and knowledge, strengthening the role of education as a source of hope during uncertain times. By the late 1930s, signs of economic recovery began to appear. Factories reopened, public works projects expanded, and schools gradually regained funding. New buildings were constructed, teachers received more consistent salaries, and textbooks were updated. The decade ended with a renewed sense of possibility, but the experiences within classrooms during the earlier years left a lasting imprint on the nation. Students who grew up in the 1930s carried with them the memory of walking long distances to school, sharing worn textbooks, or learning beside classmates who struggled with hunger or hardship. They understood resilience because they lived it daily. The world outside the classroom was changing rapidly. As international tensions rose in the final years of the decade, discussions about global affairs began to appear more frequently in older students' lessons. Teachers introduced information about international conflicts, diplomatic challenges, and shifting alliances. High school students followed news from Europe and Asia, recognizing that the world beyond America's borders was becoming increasingly complex. The decade closed with uncertainty about the global future, yet the schools that had sustained children through economic crisis remained steady institutions, preparing them for whatever challenges would come next. The legacy of schooling in 1930s America can still be felt today. It was a decade that tested the strength of communities, the creativity of educators, and the determination of families. Schools adapted because they had no choice. Teachers improvised. Students persevered. And through the collective efforts of millions of people, education continued even when resources seemed insufficient. The resilience built in those classrooms helped shape the attitudes and values of an entire generation, one that would soon face the challenges of global war and national transformation. The small wooden schoolhouses of rural America, the brick buildings of industrial cities, the segregated classrooms of the South, and the makeshift schools of migrant camps all contributed to the story of education during the 1930s. Each carried its own realities, shaped by economic conditions, regional culture, and social structure. Yet all shared a common purpose: to provide knowledge, stability, and hope in a time when these were urgently needed. Walking through the memories of those years is like moving through a landscape marked by determination. The children who learned to read by lantern light, the teachers who taught without knowing when they would be paid, the families who sent children to school despite hunger or hardship. Each played a role in sustaining the nation's educational foundation. The decade revealed how deeply communities valued learning, even when circumstances made it difficult. Their commitment laid the groundwork for the modernization of American schools in the decades that followed. As the final year of the 1930s approached, the tone in classrooms slowly shifted. Students sensed change. Teachers introduced new textbooks printed with fresher ink and updated lessons. Communities repaired roofs, installed new lighting, or expanded libraries. Schools that had once struggled to heat classrooms now planned for brighter futures. The improvements did not erase the hardships of the early decade, but they marked the beginning of a new era. The children who walked through those doors carried the memory of difficult times, yet they also carried a deeper appreciation for education and the stability it offered. In the quiet reflection of history, the experience of attending school in 1930s America stands as a testament to perseverance. The lessons learned in those classrooms extended beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic. They included endurance, adaptability, cooperation, and hope. These were the values that helped sustain communities through hardship and prepared the next generation for a rapidly changing world. The school bell that rang across fields and city streets during that decade did more than mark the beginning and end of the school day. It echoed the determination of families who believed in the power of education, even in the harshest of times. It signaled the presence of a teacher ready to guide, a student ready to learn, and a community still holding on to the belief that knowledge could build a better future. The bell's sound carried across the land as a quiet reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, learning continues, shaping the nation's spirit one lesson at a time. And as the children of that decade stepped out of their classrooms at the end of each day, walking down roads lined with dust, snow, or city noise, they carried with them the resilience born inside those school walls, moving steadily toward the uncertain years ahead with the silent strength that only education in hard times can give.